Welcome, everybody. We've got a great crowd, and we'd like to get started. President Obama and Mitt Romney couldn't be here today, but we're going to have an even better debate. And I just want to welcome you here on behalf of the partners to the Nonprofit Issues Forum, which includes the Nonprofit Studies Program at Georgia State, the Woodruff Arts Center, the Foundation Center Atlanta, the Southeastern Council of Foundations, United Way of Metro Atlanta, and the Georgia Humanities Council, with a little help from Alston and Bird. So we're extremely grateful and proud of this flourishing partnership. And before I say anything else, I want to turn the podium over to Virginia Hepner, who is the new president of the Woodruff Arts Center, to greet you to this wonderful facility.
Good morning. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you for what you're doing for all of us in the community. It's really great to be part of it. I'm here on behalf of my colleagues who create this fabulous art at the Woodruff Arts Center, and I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't tell you what's on right now. So, and the box office opens at 10, so you'll have plenty of time on the way out. But, I mean, come on, this is important. But really, it's thrilling to have you here. This is the closing weekend for the Alliance Theater's What I Learned in Paris, Pearl Clegg's play. If you haven't seen it, try to get a ticket. It got extended. It's so fabulous, especially the history of Atlanta is in there. Museum of Modern Art partnership show starts next week, which is 164 pieces on loan from the Museum of Modern Art, which many of which have never left that museum, so that's pretty exciting. And last night, the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra opened its season, which was very exciting, and it was sold out. That's worthy of applause, and for every reason, and it was magical. And so I just wanted to thank you for having arts as part of this. I personally am a huge believer of how important we are in terms of connecting each other, and it's a way to communicate that sometimes is difficult to do in another way. So I'm thrilled to be here. I can't wait to hear Lester's comments and the panel. Thank you for being here.
Just as personal testimony, what we learned in Paris is fantastic. I've seen it. So welcome again, and we have a wonderful crowd here representing a wide cross-section of the nonprofit sector in Georgia, not just restricted to Atlanta. I met a few of you from outside the Atlanta area outside. And let me give a special welcome to my students in PMAP 8210, Introduction to the Masters, in our master's degree class to the nonprofit sector. If you guys want to stand up, I'll take attendance and just make sure. Thank you, thank you. And we're using Lester's book, so don't forget to get his autograph afterwards on his book. Nonprofit Issues Forum has had, this is our fourth successful collaborative year among many leading Atlanta nonprofit institutions, and our purpose has been to bring a high level of discussion of critical issues to our community. And I thank all of our partners for their efforts to support and help and promote and administer this program over the years. We've had some important conversations here, and today will be absolutely no exception. Indeed, this might be the most important conversation we have of all, and I think that there are several reasons for that. One, obviously, this is a presidential election year, and the future health and vitality of the nonprofit sector may indeed hang in the balance. The timing of this session is also fortunate, with the very recent publication of the second edition of The State of Nonprofit America, the book that you can purchase at a very good discount outside and even get Lester to sign. I think it's the most definitive and comprehensive documentation of the issues facing the sector and its prospects for the future. And I hope you will read all 681 pages of it. And my students are doing just that. Most importantly, the state of the nonprofit sector is critical, as you all appreciate, to the health and vitality of our entire society, given its critical functions in education, health, social justice, human services, the arts, and indeed the workings of our democracy itself. We've been through terrible times recently, and the problems persist. Meanwhile, the sector has not only been the safety net for many of those who have suffered, but in Professor Salomon's words, it's been amazingly resilient itself, holding steady as business and government have failed us in various ways, including shedding jobs and shrinking financial support for nonprofit work. So this is now a critical juncture for the sector and exactly the right time to have this conversation about how it is to survive and prosper going forward. Before I introduce our speaker, and I'll also introduce our panelists ahead of time, so we can make the transition later in the program, but I wanted to take a moment to remember two nonprofit sector leaders whom we've recently lost. One is Sam Goldman, the recent executive director of the Callan-Wald Arts Center for many years, and a beloved and dedicated nonprofit executive in our community, and a good friend to me. I want to remember Sam not only for his outstanding leadership of Callan-Wald, for which he's already received many tributes, but also for his contributions to Georgia State University, from which he received his doctorate. Sam contributed on many occasions to our classes, and he loved to work with our students and our faculty. The second is Peter Goldberg, former president of the National Alliance for Families and Children. Peter was a prominent national leader, former president of Independent Sector, and holder of many other national leadership positions. I also counted Peter among my friends. And indeed, he took time from his enormously busy schedule to teach in our executive leadership program, ELPNO, a couple of years in a row, and was looking forward to continuing that program that we offer every June in partnership with the Fanning Institute at University of Georgia and Georgia Tech Center on Entrepreneurial Leadership. And unfortunately, Peter was looking forward to greater involvement in the academy when he was unexpectedly taken from us. Both Sam and Peter had gold in their last names, and that was most appropriate. And Peter was a good friend of Lester as well. And you will note in the State of Nonprofit America that the book is dedicated to Peter Goldberg's memory. Now for the introductions. You have, I hope, picked up some fairly extensive bios of our speakers and panelists, so I'm going to only highlight a few points on the interest of time. The panel will come on stage after Lester speaks, and this screen will magically rise to provide them with accommodations. Our panel consists of Joe Arnold, Alicia Phillip, and Dave McMurtry. Joe Arnold, Joe, perhaps you want to stand and show yourself, is the Senior Vice President at SunTrust Bank and a stalwart supporter and mentor to nonprofit organizations in our community. He serves on the governing boards of the Atlanta Union Mission, the Boy Scouts Atlanta Area Council, the YMCA of Metro Atlanta, the Greater Atlanta Christian School, and on the advisory board of the Foundation Center Atlanta. I probably missed some. And proudly for us, he's a member of the advisory board for the Nonprofit Studies program at Georgia State University and actually a frequent speaker, a guest speaker in our classes. Alicia Phillip is probably known to all of you. She is president of the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta and has led that foundation in its phenomenal growth for more than 30 years, having obviously started as a teenager. I learned very recently that she's also Les Salomon's former dance partner. She can explain that to you. She served on various national and local nonprofit boards, including the Council on Foundations, the Southeastern Council on Foundations, Independent Sector, and the National Center on Family Philanthropy, and indeed on the advisory board of the Andrew Young School at Georgia State, where she is former chair of our Nonprofit Studies Program Advisory Board. Dave McMurtry is Senior Vice President for Strategy at Habitat for Humanity International. He has had a successful business career before joining Habitat, including key leadership roles at Intuit. You probably use many of the products of Intuit, and has been CEO of several technology startup companies. He has been heavily involved in nonprofit work outside of Habitat, including volunteering with Doctors Without Borders, the World Affairs Council, and Kiva. And we also learned recently that he's an avid motorcyclist, and you need to see his electric motorcycle. We all need to see his electric motorcycle. So now let me introduce our speaker of the day, Lester Salomon. It's not an easy task, given his prolific record of accomplishments. You already know that he's Alicia's former dance partner. You also have his bio, so I will offer just a few of my favorite highlights, my impression of Lester's career. Lester is one of the original pioneer scholars of the nonprofit sector, and arguably, that's just for sake of argument, the most influential one in the world of research and public policy. From my point of view, his career follows an almost mind-boggling trajectory of expanding scope and impact. In the 1980s and early 90s, he and Alan Abramson challenged the policies of the Reagan administration head-on, analyzing the impact of proposed federal budget cuts. Does that sound familiar? And conclusively showing that government retrenchment could not simply be offset by increasing voluntary contributions, as some naive or possibly malign policymakers had argued. Early on as well, Les led pioneer studies of the size and the scope of the nonprofit sector, first in major US metropolitan areas and later nationwide, creating a primer on the sector, the third edition of which has just come out and serves as a standard text in many university programs, including ours, and that too is for sale outside later if you'd like, and you can get Lester's signature on it. Not content with mapping the US nonprofit sector, Les literally took on the world, working with Helmut Anheuer in the 1990s to establish the Johns Hopkins University Comparative Nonprofit Sector Project that maps the third sector in more than 40 countries around the world and has produced the book, Global Civil Society, Dimensions of the Nonprofit Sector. Always concerned with policy issues, Lester launched the new millennium by assembling, I think I'm complimenting myself with this too, by assembling an erudite group of top scholars to compile the first edition of The State of Nonprofit America, an influential tome, not quite as big as the current edition, designed to connect policymakers with the best thinking and research about nonprofit-related issues. And today, as I mentioned, we celebrate the long-awaited second edition of that book. Les was also instrumental in the formation of what's known as ISTAR, the International Society of Third Sector Research, the worldwide association for scholars of the third sector, and indeed, ISTAR is still headquartered at Johns Hopkins University, where Lester is based. Les has also been honored multiple times by Arnova, which is the US Association of Nonprofit Scholars, receiving its awards for Best Book in 1996, the Virginia A. Hodgkinson Award for Best Research Publication in 2001, and its Distinguished Career Award in 2003. Les has always been good at deflating myths with facts and innovative theories that challenge common but often incorrect wisdom. He helped discredit the idea that society could allow nonprofits to go alone without government support. And indeed, he formulated a theory of third-party government to help us understand how nonprofits and government were joined at the hip. He deflated the hubris of some Americans by showing that we indeed were not the only country with a significant third sector, Alexis de Tocqueville notwithstanding. He challenged prevailing economic theory that tried to explain international differences in nonprofit sector prominence by the heterogeneity of their population's preferences, developing instead a theory of social origins that highlighted the different historical paths and governance traditions through which different countries' third sectors evolved. And more recently, he has insisted, through factual analysis and trenchant conceptualization, that contrary to the pessimism of some, that the US nonprofit sector is resilient, not easily dismissed, and indeed more important than ever in these very troubled times. I know that Les is ready to challenge us today with his thinking about the state of nonprofit America. Please welcome Professor Lester Salomon.
So one thing I think I've learned already this morning is that I should not confide any personal secrets to Dennis Young. Sorry about that, Alicia. So it's a delight for me to be back here in Atlanta. We did some of our earliest work here in Atlanta with Alicia. We were both teenagers at the time, and it's a delight to be back and to see the thriving nonprofit sector that is in existence here. And I have many old friends here as a consequence. Alicia and Janine Lee, if she's here, and Dennis, of course, Maxine Carpenter, we knew her, and Martin Layfield, somewhere in this audience. Martin had an enormous impact on my life when he was running a Woodrow Wilson program that sent graduate students from the north to the south to help people in this part of the world, part of the country, break down some of those barriers that were keeping a significant portion of the population out of good education and out of voting and out of all those things that make them citizens. And it was in that environment that I really became aware of the nonprofit sector, though of course in those days we did not have a word for this. We knew civil rights organizations and we knew some environmental organizations, but the idea that there was something called the nonprofit sector was a brand new idea, hard to believe now, but it was not in the academic world, it was not in the research community. It was there in front of our face, but we had not any conception and any theory or any body of knowledge to put it into perspective. And so I stumbled into the nonprofit sector, and I think, Martin, I should say to all Dennis's students who are struggling with this book that you are responsible for their pain. So what I'm going to do today is talk about the future of nonprofit America. And I'm reminded, of course, of that wonderful Yogi Berra phrase. You've all heard it. Berra, the sage philosopher of our time, it advised us that we should never make predictions, particularly about the future. And I'm going to defy Yogi's comments. I'm going to draw very heavily on this very weighty book, which serves as a weightlifting tool as well as a source of great knowledge. It just sort of grew out of hand. What I want to do first is just start off by reminding all of us of the scale of this sector that we're talking about, the nonprofit sector. I think we have a tendency to think of it as kind of a sidelight, a small entity off to the side that is nice for us to think about in terms of social purposes and philosophical intent. But the idea that it's a major economic force is something that we, I think, tend to forget. And I just want to fix what I'm going to say in a realization of the just enormous scale of this sector. It turns out that the nonprofit sector, if you just consider the full-time paid employee, is the third largest workforce in this country. There are only two other workforces that exceed, this is the paid staff, retail, trade, and manufacturing. But construction, finance, insurance, transportation, agriculture, utilities, they are all smaller than the nonprofit sector. And if you throw in the volunteers and translate volunteer work into full-time equivalent terms, you're talking about the largest workforce in this country of all the 18 industries into which economists carve up a country's economy. And so we're talking about something really significant. And because of that, we need to take it much more seriously, I think, than we ever have before. And so what I want to do is take a look at what is happening to this sector, because my theme today is that the nonprofit sector, this huge set of people devoting their efforts to essentially public purposes, solving public problems, we're in a struggle for the soul of nonprofit America, for the heart of nonprofit America. There are things going on in the country, have been going on for some time, that really pose a fundamental challenge to what it is we think this sector is about and should be about. And if we don't face up to that reality and understand the power of some of these forces that are drawing the sector in directions that in many respects are very good for the sector because they have allowed it to thrive, but nevertheless seem potentially to be eating away at the heart and soul of the sector, so that we may end up with a nonprofit sector that we can't feel as good about as the one that we've had in the past. In particular, the way I've tried to structure this is to organize it around what I see as 4 very powerful impulses that are pulling the sector in different directions. And it's not as if one has to dominate over the other. They can all be balanced, but we have to be conscious about what this set of pressures looks like. So the first impulse is the impulse of voluntarism. This is the historic impulse of the sector. It's the things that generate volunteering and generate philanthropy. And it has a certain impact on the sector. It's sort of where the sector has come from. And there are many people who believe that really what we ought to do is go back to some golden age of voluntarism, and all our problems will be solved. The second impulse is the impulse of professionalism. This was the impulse that really gained considerable weight in the 1960s when the federal government began to finance services in a heavy way, and as is common with government, we wanted professional services. We didn't want simply amateur services, and it gave a great impulse to professional work within the sector. The third impulse is the impulse of civic activism. This is the impulse that pushes the sector into the role of being a source of empowerment, of giving voice to the voiceless, and of seeing that as its fundamental purpose. And then finally, and importantly, we have in recent years the very powerful impulse of commercialism that has come into the sector in an enormously powerful way, along with its next of kin, which is managerialism, or managerial professionalism as opposed to subject matter professionalism. Each of these impulses has a whole set of consequences and implications for the concept, the operation of the nonprofit sector. Each one has a perceived role for the sector. Each one has a particular strategy that it brings to the table. Each one has a particular style of operation. Each one has a set of reference groups that are especially important to it. Each one has a preferred organizational structure, so the structure of the sector is affected by which of these impulses is dominant. Each one has a managerial style, and each one of them has a resource base. So just to very quickly give you a taste for what these impulses consist of, they are all laid out in merciless detail in the book. But let me just say a few words about a few of them. So let's take up the role and objectives. The voluntary impact impulse, fundamentally sees the role of the sector as fixing value defects in people. That somehow people who are suffering from poverty, there is a value problem that they're facing, and that the voluntaristic impulse, at least in its modern form, wasn't always that way, really is attempting to inculcate a set of values, and along the way are quite willing to provide direct assistance to relieve suffering, but they're trying to transform individuals. The professional impulse is very different. It takes a kind of medical approach and basically says that, yes, there are problems in the people, but they're not value problems. They are because people don't have a good education or they have a physical impediment, and therefore the role of the sector ought to be to provide services that allow people to overcome these impediments and to escape the so-called culture of poverty. And that was a very dominant theme in the 1960s. Civic activism says, no, you've all got it wrong. The problem is not in the people who are poor or who are suffering. The problem is in the society. It is creating an unequal playing field that people can't operate in. And until you correct those structures of power, you're not going to make progress on the problems that we face. And then finally, there is the commercialism impulse, and its basic objective is really to create sustainable social businesses that deliver the services, but not in a medical form and more in a business type of fashion with revenues and with responsibilities and a more efficient address of social problems. And this then in turn translates into different strategies. The strategy for the voluntarist impulse is to change values, to offer material assistance, to encourage self-help, to do all those things to change people's outlook in life. The professionalism impulse, its strategy is very different. Professional treatment offers services, establish rights to services, so the universalistic nature of services. Some would call it entitlements, a word that we have heard bandied about in our political discourse recently, very much consistent with this notion that people have a basic right to certain services, certain qualities, certain quality of life. Civic activism takes this asset model. The problem is not the poor, that's our asset. They are a powerful force for political action. We need an advocacy strategy. We need to organize citizens, build leadership, do community organizing, another word that has been somewhat in our political debate of late. And then the commercialism impulse is pushing us in the direction of promoting social entrepreneurs, pursuing self-sustaining income, measuring results. You all have been, I'm sure, aware of all of these new concepts of how we should go about operating the nonprofit sector. And then in turn, each of these has a different style. So the voluntaristic style is sort of pastoral. Some people would even call it paternalistic at times. It has that danger. Very particularistic, organized in some cases around particular religious convictions and church groups, which is one of its great strengths, but also carves out the population of people in need into religious communities instead of into a broader community. The professionalist impulse, its style of operation is medical. It has a very medical type approach. And so the social work profession has for years and years been attempting to get itself identified as a profession with certain criteria of achievement, certain education. They use casework as the mode of delivery of their services, so a very medical kind of approach. The civic activism impulse is really pushing in a very different direction. Participation of the poor, confrontational, critical in its approach to society, and then the commercialism impulse, entrepreneurial, managerial, profit-focused, measurement-driven. These are the sort of key points. So these are the impulses that I think are abroad in the land. Now, how these impulses play out, which one dominates, will depend on the kinds of challenges that the nonprofit sector is facing at a particular point in time and how the sector copes with those challenges. And so what we need to do is to take a look at some of those challenges and then take a look at how the nonprofit sector has responded, and then ask ourselves, is this the direction that we would hope that this sector would go on in the future? So let me start with some of the challenges. And in the book, I think I lay out 5 or 6 of them. I want to focus here on 2 or 3 of them. The first one is the most obvious one, and it is the perennial fiscal challenge faced by the nonprofit sector. Unlike the other 2 sectors, the nonprofit sector does not have a natural source of revenue unless you think of philanthropy as its natural source of revenue. And as you'll hear later, that source has petered out, sadly, many decades ago in terms of being sufficient to cope with the scale of problems that a modern industrial society faces. The one fundamental part of the fiscal picture of the nonprofit sector has to look at public sector support. Because if there was one thing that really transformed the American nonprofit sector in our lifetimes, and my lifetime probably goes a little longer than some of you, it is the enormous growth of government support that occurred from the mid-50s, but really massively into the 60s. And this is the picture of that growth spurt. It's broken down into total. It's a little hard to see the white line. I apologize for that. The purple here is pensions, yellow is education, health is kind of aqua, and welfare is, this is social services for the most part, is green. And you can see that when the 60s came along, this was of course the Great Society, there was a spurt of government involvement at the federal level in social purpose activities, education, social work, social services, health, a massive upsurge of that kind of support. And while it's not well known, as Dennis was kind enough to note, one of the things that I have emphasized in my work is how much of that support actually went out to nonprofit organizations, that we created this massive system, not of bloated government, but of a partnership between government and the nonprofit sector. And it was really in this period that the nonprofit sector in America took the shape that we know it today. Prior to that, it was a much more almost invisible presence, without the kind of scale, without the kind of importance, and without the kind of ability to cope with problems that it acquired during the 60s and early 70s. But I know you know the story of what happened beginning in the 1980s in particular. There was a very sharp reduction of that support, particularly for the social service type programs. That's this green line, so this is the 80s. The second thing that happened was the tremendous continued growth of health spending. And so we experienced two things. One, a shrinking of social welfare spending and an increased medicalization of all the social welfare spending of the government. And that process has continued. Since the 1980s, there was pretty considerable recovery of some of that spending, but most of it went into the medical programs. And in fact, many social service providers got smart enough to realize that if they wanted to survive in this kind of environment, they had to retorque what they were doing and redefine it as health. And so you found developmental disability agencies all over the country basically taking what were formerly described as social service programs and retorquing them and redefining them as as basically health programs that could attract Medicaid funding. And so today, the overwhelming majority of that kind of support comes out of Medicaid. It is a different structure of support. So what happened in the period since the mid-1990s was considerable growth of government social welfare spending, and with it of support to nonprofits, but very uneven. Overwhelmingly, health was the big winner, and the much more laggard growth occurred in welfare and social services, as well as in housing. And we were put through, the nonprofit sector was put through a whole series of recurrent crises as new budget doctrines came into effect. 2 or 3 recessions. The one before the 2009 one was in 2002. You may remember it. It was the early Bush administration. And at that time, we went out and surveyed nonprofit organizations through a project we call the Listening Post Project. It is a network of about 1,500 organizations across the country that we've recruited to be our eyes and ears on what's happening to the nonprofit sector, because the data systems in the country are so dreadful. We're always 5 or 8 years behind knowing what's happening. And when we went out to them in that time period, they were reporting, over half of them were reporting severe or very severe budget constraints, another 35% experiencing moderate strains, and only about 14% were escaping these fiscal pressures. So this sector has been living with a whole series of fiscal challenges coming out of the uncertainties of federal government support and the transformations that have occurred. But that's not the only thing that's affecting the fiscal health of the sector. In addition to the amounts of government support, there's been a revolution in the forms of government support that have been extremely significant for the nonprofit sector. We're changing massively, we have changed massively from essentially producer-side subsidies, that is funding that goes to the organization, to consumer-side subsidies, that is money that goes to the consumer of services. This has all been driven by a philosophy that says that the most efficient way to allocate these resources is to put them in the hands of the people who are going to use them, and they will make the choices that will be the most efficient for the economy. It's a very strong argument. Philosophically, it has very profound consequences for the nonprofit sector because it means that the nonprofits that have not historically been in the business of going into the market, advertising for their services and otherwise operating as for-profit entities, now are required to do that. They have to go in and appeal for consumers, much the way a for-profit does, and that has not been their particular skill. And the scope of this has been massive. You know, in the 60s and early 70s, probably 60 to 70% of all federal money flowing to nonprofits took the form of producer-side subsidies. By the late 1980s into the 1990s, the share that took the form of consumer-side subsidies was 60 or 70%. It takes the form of vouchers, and I would treat, this is probably not the smart thing to say, but I treat Medicaid and Medicare as a voucher because essentially, like a voucher, it delivers funds to individuals and then they can choose which provider to go to. They can go any hospital they want, a public one, a private one, a nonprofit one. But it's also tax subsidies are another form of this kind of consumer side subsidy. And we used to have a very robust social service grant program with funds flowing to nonprofit providers. We now have a massive child care tax credit, which provides child care tax credits to people for them to use any way they want. Well, the social service block grant program for all types of social services, including child care, is about a $2.8 billion program. And the child care tax credits, if you add all of the tax credits up that are existing in the government, is about an $8.5 billion. So it's now 4 times bigger than the social service grant program. So we have really reversed completely the relationship between the federal government and nonprofit providers and put nonprofits into a very difficult market situation. The third element of this fiscal situation, and a controversial one, is what's been happening with giving, with charitable giving. Giving is frequently celebrated. We rejoice every time Giving USA issues its latest estimate. The figures are mind-boggling in certain ways, $300 billion. But when you look carefully in relation to the two things that giving is related to, that is personal income and the finances overall of the nonprofit sector, the story is much more troubling because it's not the case that giving has been growing as a share of our personal income, and it's not the case that it's been growing as a share of the income of the nonprofit sector, quite the contrary. So let me just show you some of the data that I've put together. This reports the average amount of giving as a share of personal income. First in the decade of the 1970s, it was 1.86%. In the decade of the 80s, it dropped down to 1.78. In the decade of the early 90s, it was down to 1.64% of personal income. It then staged a recovery in the dot-com period from 1997 to 2007. But when you look at its growth in relation to the income total of the sector, you realize that it really has not moved the needle very much. So in 1997, giving from all sources to service and expressive organizations. These are the organizations that deliver the daycare and the hospital care and the education. They're the operating components of the nonprofit sector. The other component that you could look at is religious congregations, which is a different component, also receiving significant philanthropic support. So if we look only at the service and expressive organizations, it went from 9.5% of the total income to 10.2. That is definitely an increase, but it is not an increase that really has moved the needle in a very fundamental way for these service and expressive organizations. It simply has not had, even in this decade of the dot-com explosion in the country, when giving did rise more than normally, more than recently, I should say. And if you put it all together, include religious congregations as well as service and expressive, it actually dropped a little from 17.5% down to 16.6%. And we now know what's happening to giving as a consequence of the 2008 recession. It has actually declined. That is, not only has it not kept pace with the growth of the sector or the growth of personal income, it's actually gone down in absolute terms and has barely climbed back to where it was in 2007. So there are significant fiscal challenges facing the sector of quite substantial proportions, causing the sector to have a state of nerves, I think, all the time. But that's just one part of the story. There is a second challenge that has hit the sector pretty hard, and this is the challenge of competition. In certain ways, this is a byproduct of the shifts of government support. When government changes the structure of its funding from a producer-side subsidy, in which nonprofits have a bit of a leg up, to a consumer-side subsidy, it invites other competitors into those markets. And for-profit competitors have moved very aggressively into markets that were once nonprofit. And that story has been going on for 20 years now. So this is data that looks at the period from 1982 to 1997. And in a whole series of fields, daycare, for example, this top part is employment, and the bottom part is facilities. So daycare employment, 52% of that was nonprofit in 1982, was down to 38% by 1997. You can see this in home health and other area. This was a field that was dominated, invented by nonprofits. So 60% of the employment was in nonprofits in 1982. That was down to 28% in 1997. And the same story can be told for dialysis centers, for rehabilitation hospitals, for health maintenance organizations, for psychiatric hospitals. There is a very profound competitive challenge that has been hitting nonprofit organizations. And this challenge has continued. We now have data that takes the story up through 2007, and you can see the continuation and the extension of this competitive challenge. One of the new areas that has been penetrated by for-profits is in the individual and family services field. This is Peter Goldberg's field. If he were here, he would be wringing his hands about this development. Why is this happening? Why is it that the for-profits are competing so effectively with nonprofits? So there are two possible answers. One is they're better. They provide better services, do it more efficiently. And I think that may be part of the answer. But there is another part that has attracted my attention, and that is the uneven playing field that nonprofits have when it comes to generating capital. And this is particularly significant when you have a surge of demand. You need facilities. You have to build offices. You have to buy equipment. And nonprofits are disadvantaged in generating capital because of the fact that they simply cannot go into the market and issue stock. Who would buy stock of an organization that can't pay dividends? There's no stock market for nonprofits. So the best source of capital in the American economy is off the screen or has been off the screen for nonprofits. And so we saw this very powerfully in the case of home health care. Home health care in 1980 was suddenly made eligible for reimbursement by Medicare. This was all the push to get people out of spending as much time in hospitals, reduce hospital costs, create a whole network of home health facilities. and thereby reduce the per-day cost of treatments. And nonprofits invented the home health industry and were the pioneers in pushing that forward. Well, as soon as Medicare began to reimburse, the amount of money that came in was enormous. And suddenly there was just an incredible market, and the nonprofits simply couldn't move fast enough to enter that market and get the capital and build the facilities. And the result was a transformation of that industry. And so we can see this when we look at nonprofit access to capital. It used to be we thought comfortably that nonprofits are labor-intensive organizations. We don't have to worry about such nasty things as raising capital. But increasingly, the whole nonprofit sector has been affected by the same technological developments as our other parts of our economy. And so nonprofits are reporting that, that they have enormous needs for capital. This is results coming again from our Listening Post project. We went out to this 1,500 network of organizations and we said, in the last 2 years, have you needed capital? And we spelled out what specifically we meant by capital. We're not talking about operating income. We're talking about the capital you need to grow, to build facilities, to do strategic planning, to train your people, all the things that last for more than a year. Do you need any of that stuff? And what do you need it for? And they were very clear that they, 91% of them were reporting significant needs for technology, for buildings and land, for program development. So they got the message that they're supposed to do strategic planning. But you need capital. You got to get your people away from their normal work, and you need to invest in strategic planning. And then we asked them, well, how successful have you been in getting it in the last 2 years? And as you can see, very few, clearly not the majority in each one of these cases, was reporting that they were being successful. And so we asked them, so where do you go for your capital? How difficult are these different sources? And a very striking result came out of that. And fundamentally, the yellow here is that it was fairly or extremely difficult to access the source, and the blue meant we don't know these people. Who are they? And what is striking is that the major sources of capital in the American economy essentially were off base for the nonprofit sector. They were out of scope. They either had great difficulty, or more likely didn't know them. And this is the pension funds, the insurance companies, the credit unions and savings banks. The major sources of capital in the economy were off the screen for nonprofits, which meant that they were relying on commercial banks, which was favorable. I mean, it was great that commercial banks like SunTrust were there to help, but they have higher rates typically than do the insurance companies and other types of investment that are doing bonds and long-term debt. And they were going to foundations, but then they were competing with their own operating income with the foundations if they went for capital. And then individual donors, which is terrific if you are Johns Hopkins University with a big donor base and a development staff that in our case is larger than the entire number of professors in our School of Arts and Sciences, which is always just amazes me. We have about 320 professors in the School of Arts and Sciences at the great Johns Hopkins University and 350 people on our development staff. So, typical nonprofit cannot compete with that powerhouse. Don't anybody ever tell anyone that I told you that. So there is a serious problem that is explaining why it is that nonprofits are losing out in these competitive industries, and why it is that in field after field, nonprofits are losing market share. I'm not saying that they're disappearing. I'm simply saying that on the competitive border, they're not the ones that are winning the battle, and the for-profits are moving in a very aggressive way. Third challenge I want to mention, we're doing okay time-wise, is the legitimacy challenge. And this is a hard one because, in a way, the nonprofit sector has been caught in the crossfire over the debate that's going on in our country over government social programs. Those programs are not delivered by the federal government, no matter what our political leaders are telling us. They are delivered mostly by nonprofit organizations. And so when there is an attack on those programs, it really is an attack on the nonprofit sector and on its legitimacy and on its effectiveness. It has skin in that game because it is the set of entities that is being affected. And we have been subjected to a whole variety of pretty broad-based criticisms of those programs, sometimes with not a lot of evidence behind it, but it's a very popular appeal. There is also a second strain of criticism of the sector that is apparent both on the left and on the right, that the sector has become over-professionalized, that it has not been able to take sufficient advantage of just normal, everyday helping relationships, and this has echoes of the voluntaristic impulse that I described before. Why should we keep hiring professionals at a very significant cost? Why don't we find simpler ways to doing this? And so people have been talking about the fact that we are redefining human needs as problems that only professionals can solve, and that we've got to get away from that and get back to the old-fashioned religion of helping each other and not having institutions do this. So the result is a growing evidence in public opinion polls and others of a series of doubts that are raising about the real legitimacy of the sector, which is really a profound thing, particularly when the sector has begun to take on some of the trappings of the commercial sector by charging fees and seeking self-sustaining income and bringing on top talent. Which requires that you pay decent salaries. And then those salaries become the food for exposés in the newspaper. And so the sector is sort of, it's damned if it does and it's damned if it doesn't. It's a very awkward position to be in. And one very tangible evidence of this sort of weakening of the public faith in the sector and trust are the threats to the charitable deduction, which are very much part of our political debate going forward, and the very striking growth of taxation of nonprofits at the state and local level. And this, again, is something that we took up in our listening post project, and we discovered what, to me, was a very surprising scale of tax efforts on the part of state and local governments on nonprofits. We found that overall, if you add up all the different types of ways in which local governments are coming at nonprofits financially, that is through pilots, these payments in lieu of taxes, that's the most evident one, it's not the most widespread one. Very specific, field-specific taxes like ticket taxes for wonderful facilities like this, or bed taxes at group homes and things of that sort. But even more profoundly, the switching of things that used to be paid for through general taxation into user charges. And this has been a conscious strategy to get nonprofits to pay for the services that they were formerly not having to pay because they were exempt from the core property taxes. When you add it all up, 63%, almost two-thirds of our respondents told us that in the previous 2 years, they had either been challenged or they had actually been required to pay some new form of taxation. And this is, I think, a sign that the political elite sees nonprofits as vulnerable, and they are vulnerable on grounds of legitimacy and public support. So that's a pretty rough story. So let me turn the page and ask how all of you have coped with this story. And this brings me to the theme that Dennis already alluded to. What I think anybody who reads the story of how the sector has coped in the last 20 years would conclude is that this has got to be one of the most entrepreneurial, resilient set of institutions and people in our entire society, facing much more difficult demands from multiple stakeholders than any for-profit business, without the clarity of the bottom line of profit to hold up as evidence of success. And yet the sector seems constantly to find a way to survive and to grow. And that growth story is really, I think, phenomenal and impressive. But there's a dark cloud inside the silver lining. I can use a reverse image. So what's the story of growth? So The basic message is that the nonprofit sector has been on a tear economically. It has been growing, and it has been growing far faster than the other components of the society. So let me just show you two pictures, one of them for the period 1977 to 96, and one from the period 1997 to 2007. The blue is the average annual growth of GDP, and the green is the average annual growth of nonprofit revenue. So in the earlier period, nonprofits beat the GDP of the US in terms of per annual growth by about 20%. So it grew by 3.6% a year versus 3.0% a year. In this more recent period, things have actually gotten better. Here, it beat the GDP growth by about 25%, I'm sorry, 33%. So 3% versus 4%, pretty significant, and I think remarkable achievement in terms of just the scale, particularly when you think of the scale. We can see the same thing when we look at employment. We have, at Johns Hopkins, managed to gain access to this amazing data source that has existed for 40 or 50 years that covers 97% of the country's nonprofit establishments and measures their employment. The data are available by state, and they are available almost down to the metropolitan area, so one could zero in on metropolitan Atlanta if one wanted, as we have done for many other states. But we can also get a picture of what's happening to nonprofit employment in great detail. You know, by field, we can look at wage rates and things of this sort. Basically, we went into the computers of the BLS, and we were able to map the entities that were nonprofits through some computer wizardry, and we're able to pull out the nonprofits in the data file because the BLS had never made this distinction. It only reports on private employment, not realizing that inside that private employment are nonprofits as well as for-profits. And so when you do that, a very interesting story emerges. So this very complicated graph and figure tracks the growth of employment in both nonprofits, that's the green, and for-profits, that's the yellow, year by year during the decade of 2000 to 2010. And this is available on our website if anybody wants to get this report. It's called Holding the Fort, and it basically is the story of how the nonprofit sector has held the employment fort for our country right through the recession, and not just this recession, recessions before it. And if you look closely at this, I know you won't have a chance to really study it, but in every one of these 10 years, except one, and it's this one right here, which was 2004 to 5, in every other year, the growth of nonprofit employment exceeded the growth of for-profit employment every single year for the last decade. And that has continued right through the recession. So here's the recession. Here's 2007 to 2008, 2008 to 2009, 2009 to 2010. This is the nonprofit sector struggling to hold on and maintain its capacity to deliver services in the face of a really severe recession. While the for-profit sector basically went through the basement. And this is revealing of why it makes a difference whether we have a nonprofit or a for-profit sector in certain fields. Because some of these fields are very sensitive. They're treating people who are having enormously difficult lives. You don't want the institution to close down when the reimbursement rates get squeezed or when the revenue disappears. You'd like them to stay around and continue to provide services to elderly people and people with disability. And the nonprofit sector, as these data show, have a better record on that. Having said that, you can see, though, that it was not able to withstand completely, and so there is this declining growth rate that even nonprofits have experienced. So, nevertheless, it's growth. And so the next question is, so how in the world did you pull that off? How is it that this sector managed to grow during this period of uncertainty, of declining private philanthropic support? And the answer to that is the commercial impulse. I'm sorry, I had one other thing I wanted to say, which is that growth rate that I showed you before is not simply all concentrated in one area. It's not just all health. We can't dismiss it as simply it's the hospitals. In almost every field, there was a very significant growth in the environment. So it was overall 53% during this 97 to 2007 period. Health was 53%. It obviously is a very big part, but so did social services grew, and so did education and research, and so did culture and recreation. So this was a much more widespread phenomenon than we might expect. So how did this happen? So the answer is commercialization, the commercial impulse. Essentially, there has been a full force adoption of the commercial impulse into the nonprofit sector, with results that have been terrific in terms of the sector's ability to cope. We have to decide whether they have been as effective and as positive in other dimensions of the sector's work. So one piece of that was just the successful marketing to paying customers. When we look at the revenue structure of the nonprofit sector, and I know I'm throwing a lot of data at you, what comes through most clearly is that the major source of growth of revenue of the nonprofit sector for the last 10 years, probably more like the last 20 years, is fees and charges, commercial income, earned revenue. You can see it in this chart, which breaks down the three major sources of revenue of the sector. This is growth. This is how much of the growth that occurred during this period came from these different sources. And what you can see is that 58% of the growth came from fees, 30% of the growth came from government, 12% of the growth came from philanthropy. So this means that philanthropy grew a little bit as a share, but as I noted before, not enough to really make a difference. But it's really the commercial income of the sector that has been driving its growth. The sector has turned and pivoted and has found a way to increase its revenue from commercial sources, from fees and charges. And here again, this is not simply one component of the sector. This is a pretty broad story. So this first column reflects the share of the revenue for that particular type of organization that came from fees during this 1997 to 2007 period. And you can see that, yes, health is a little above the average, but education and research was right up there. Culture and recreation was right up there, and even social services has gone through now a pretty significant transformation where it was much more heavily dependent on government, to some extent dependent on philanthropy, but it gets as much of its income from fees and charges as it got from government years ago. So this has been a very significant pivot, and it's partly general marketing to paying customers. It is also successful pursuit of public funds because the whole structure of public funding changed, and so the organizations have had to pivot to learn how to deal with Medicaid, Medicare, new sources of funding with very great complexity. They've had to learn how to appeal and market their products to Medicare-eligible recipients who are equipped with a reimbursement card and who can use that card at any facility and who have to learn to come and sign up with a nonprofit. And then there's also been a relatively new phenomenon that is, I think, very exciting, and so I'm torn in my assessment of all these things, which I refer to as new frontiers of philanthropy. It's going to be the next huge impact I have on the forests of the country by producing another book called New Frontiers of Philanthropy, which is scoping out a very important new development, which is the enormous surge of new actors and new tools into social purpose activity, particularly tapping into the capital in these sources of revenue, sources of capital that I identified before, the pension funds, the insurance companies, and finding ways to entice the holders of those funds to make investments into nonprofit organizations, some of them operating various kinds of social ventures so that they can continue to grow and compete in this very competitive and difficult environment. So there has been a a transformation of the sector. And coming along with that commercialization has been this very significant growth of managerial professionalism. We are all who are involved in teaching nonprofits management part of this, bringing into the world of nonprofits different skills that fundamentally come out of the business school training, skills in how to develop business plans and how to assess self-sustaining income, how to create performance metrics to demonstrate and document what you are achieving. In a way, the sort of ethos of the business school and the business sector has come full square into the operation of the nonprofit sector. And one of my favorite examples, I hope you won't think this is inappropriate, was a story that some researchers in San Francisco told of coming across a religious organization that was training preachers. And they were using a PowerPoint, and the headline of the PowerPoint was, "Build Market Share for Jesus," which I think sort of captures captures sort of the extent to which this has penetrated into the world of. The story that I have for you today is a complicated story. It's a story of impulses pulling the sector in various ways, of a sector facing enormous challenges, and of a sector choosing one of those routes. And the route that it seems to have chosen in order to survive has been the commercial route in a very powerful way. And I think there are enormous benefits that come from this, maybe even changing the attitudes of the public. But I think we need to be aware also of the risks that it brings with it as well, and I think they are very significant risks. So I think there's a growing identity crisis of the sector, enormous confusion in the public mind and in the mind of the media over what is this sector anyway, and why do we give them special tax advantages if they're fundamentally operating just like for-profit businesses in the same fields with the same revenue base. Maybe we have to rethink this. And so there's this real question of the identity, this sort of central concept that underlies the sector. The second thing is that this puts enormous demands on nonprofit managers. So now not only are they having to worry about their board and keep the board happy and convince the board that but for them they would go out of business, and keep their donors happy and convince them, not tell them these ugly truths that I've conveyed to you this morning about where the giving actually sits in the finances of the sector, make the legislators happy and the public officials happy, and then pivot and turn and be essentially market-driven entrepreneurs, competing against very skilled and very able for-profit entrepreneurs who have access to forms of capital already that would make most nonprofits green with envy. So very tough job for nonprofit managers. So any of you here who are nonprofit managers, you should pat yourselves on the back because you're doing an amazing job. A third challenge and problem is the threat of mission creep that these pressures will create. So every nonprofit is having to think in terms of its strategic plan something about how it's going to generate revenue. So if you're operating in a community like this, there is a very strong temptation to put your next facility out in the suburbs where the paying customers are, as opposed to in the inner city where maybe the major problems are. And so we're seeing through this BLS data the suburbanization of the nonprofit sector. And again, I can't say that that's wrong, but it's a painful kind of decision that any nonprofit has to make about where to put its facilities when one of the most central considerations is where can I find paying customers that can cross-subsidize what I want to do to the people who can't pay for it. Fourth thing, I think all of this development is disadvantaging small agencies. The threshold for survival, I think, has increased because of the skills that you have to have. You cannot run a Medicaid program with a half-time accountant. I mean, this is a major operation that requires a different level of skill and a different investment. And so you have to achieve a certain scale to be able to be good at this. And one of the great advantages of this sector has always been that it would welcome new ideas and be a source of innovation. Even if that's inefficient in the short run, we make a bet as a country that in the long run is how we innovate in the social sphere, just as we attempt to innovate in the private sphere. And then finally, at the end of the day, there is this looming threat of losing public trust as we make changes that we haven't brought the public along to understand. And so the public is still rooted in this Norman Rockwell image of this sector as purely voluntary, very low-paid staff, supported mostly by philanthropy, and then they read about these big government grants or the income from fees, and they just get confused. And that's a very dangerous thing for a sector that ultimately depends on public trust. So where do we go? We had a conversation, and Alicia took me to task for not saying where we go. So I'm going to make sure we take account of that. And in the book, I outline 3 scenarios that I think face the nonprofit sector given where it is at the present time. And I realize I'm making very broad generalizations and that some of this will apply in more in some fields than in others, but I'm struck by how widespread it is. The first scenario option, and the most likely, is that we just continue to drift, that the sector is doing okay financially. It has significant support. It has strong boards. It has good and increasingly good managers. What's the problem? Let's just continue to drift into this commercial mode of operation with occasional bows to the importance of philanthropy and continued nurturing of our philanthropic support. So it's a viable option, and it's the most likely option. My concern is that it's an option that is going to erode further the kind of support that this sector needs to protect some of the privileges that it needs in order to keep its soul, its heart, its focus, its raison d'etre clear. The second scenario is one that I think the new generation of people in this sector are attracted to. It basically says, listen, nonprofit is an old idea. We're ready for a new idea, and that new idea is social ventures, businesses that serve a social purpose, but that use business arrangements. So let's just make a clean break, and let's put our chips into the social enterprise basket. And that's very appealing. There have begun to be legal changes, and as I said, there has been a really surge of new actors and new tools that are really making that, for the first time, a viable option, at least a much more viable option. The trouble is that the distinctions are going to get blurred very quickly between those social ventures, even more so than they are between nonprofits and the business sector. And unless we build really important regulatory restrictions that make sure that they are really truly serving a social purpose in a principal way, this could explode very, very quickly. So the third option that I come to, I call the renewal scenario. And the renewal scenario says, listen, we don't need to get rid of this nonprofit sector, but we do need to renew its central core, its central set of ideas, its values. And then we need to build and improve certain things that are giving it difficulty today. And imagine a world in which there is a revitalized social sector that includes a very strong nonprofit core, but also a very strong social enterprise component. So what does this scenario call for? The first thing it calls for, in my view, is the articulation of a very clear and very broadly endorsed sense of the value proposition of the nonprofit sector. Value proposition is a term that comes out of the business school training. It's what a business tries to identify as its particular niche in the market. What is it that makes it special compared to its competitors? And the same thing can be done for a sector. What is it, at the end of the day, that really we would defend as nonprofits as making our sector particularly special in its contribution to the society? And we've been trying to take a first step at this in our Listening Post project, and we will soon be issuing a communique on the nonprofit value proposition that is an attempt to understand across this broad 1,500 network of organizations, what will the sector salute as its key value adds in our society? And we've zeroed it down and narrowed it down, we think, to 7 key notions that seem to be the summary of the sector's value add. We've called it the PERC standard. We'll have to see whether that will continue to fly. So what we're saying is that what really makes the sector special is its combination of attributes, this particular combination of attributes. That it is productive, which is an attribute that sometimes the sector forgets. That is, that it creates jobs and economic value, that it mobilizes certain resources that it alone generates, like charitable gifts and volunteers, and that it brings all sorts of assets to the table to solve public problems, some of them non-financial, some of them are convening responsibilities. That the sector is effective, that it provides programs and services of the highest quality at reasonable cost. So it's not in the cost-cutting mode, it is in the mode of quality and effectiveness. That it makes a difference in the lives of people and communities. Thirdly, that it's empowering, that it mobilizes and empowers citizens, that it contributes to public discourse, that it provides opportunities for civic engagement. This is, again, a unique function that this sector critically performs, and we would worry if it begins to disappear, as there is some evidence it's doing. Fourthly, it's enriching, that it gives expression to central human values, that it provides opportunities for people to learn and grow, that it fosters scientific and intellectual progress, that it preserves culture and history, all the work that arts and culture, these wonderful institutions like this one perform. What am I up to? Fifth, that it's responsive. Let's see if I've got that on my list. So that it responds to human needs, that it does so in an effective and in a compelling way. So it responds to clients, it responds to patrons, it responds to communities, it meets needs that the market may not be able to respond to and the government may not yet have decided to respond to, that it pursues innovation. These are all sort of features of being responsive. That it's reliable, that it's resilient, that it demonstrates staying power, both in good times and bad. And I think this is one of the features that has come out of the data that I presented this morning, that it operates in a trustworthy and accountable manner. And then finally, and I think long regarded as one of the true values of this sector, that it is fundamentally caring, that it serves underserved populations, provides services and programs at reduced or no cost, and that it's community focused. So these seem to me to be fundamental values that we ought to get this sector to begin to use to articulate what it is that makes this special. And that this, or some altered version of this list, could become a basis for conversations within organizations, at the board retreats, within communities. Do we have a nonprofit sector that truly is productive and effective and empowering and so forth? Ultimately, what has to happen is that the sector needs to acquire a voice that can articulate its value add to lots of stakeholders. And I think it needs to do it quickly. That's one element of the renewal strategy. A second element is to learn the benefits of and improve the government-nonprofit partnership. We have been, for years, a little defensive about the extent of government support. People refer to it as dependence. Well, in Europe, they call it subsidiarity. They say that the government needs to back off in the delivery of services so that it can capture the qualities of the nonprofit sector. We need a language for this, and we need to be less defensive and more supportive of it. It is an important way for the sector to help to finance itself and allow it to perform all those special functions that it's very difficult to get paying customers to support. A third priority is improving the access to capital. And there are several ideas here. One of them is to transform our foundations into philanthropic banks that get out of simply using grants as the source of their contributions to the nonprofit sector and recognized the possibility of using other financial instruments the way government does and the way the business sector does. And so instead of providing a grant to build a building, you can provide a loan or a loan guarantee. You can go into partnership with a commercial bank or with an insurance company to finance the activities of the nonprofit sector. We're seeing this happen. In fact, I think the Community Foundation of Atlanta is already experimenting with many of these devices. But we need to rethink the concept of a foundation. And instead of using 5% of its assets and having it basically invest the rest, just like any investment firm, we need to think of ways to tap into the asset base using novel tools of finance to serve the mission of the foundation with the entire corpus and not with just the 5% payout. And then we need to incentivize the for-profit sector to invest as well into nonprofit capital needs. And one way to do that is through something akin to the low-income housing tax credit, which is already on the books and which has stimulated a very significant growth of low-income housing and community development. We need to broaden that to other types of nonprofit action so that we can get this level playing field for nonprofit capital. I think there needs to be something done to kickstart private giving again. And my entry into this debate is to move from a tax deduction system to a tax credit system. A tax deduction system, the amount of your charitable tax benefit is geared to your income level. The higher the income level, the higher the tax bracket you're in, the more it's worth to make $1 of charitable contribution. A tax credit gives the same amount of tax benefit to every contributor, regardless of the tax bracket that they're in. It democratizes giving. It makes it more of an everyday, every person responsibility, and it gets it out of the category of being somehow a perk for the rich, which makes it a much more easy target for political decisions of the sort that we're now facing. And so I would urge this as a way to just open up the whole conversation about how to stimulate charitable giving more aggressively. And then finally, we need to do something to make what's happening to the nonprofit sector visible to the public and what the nonprofit sector is doing visible in a positive way. Most of our public media campaigns about the nonprofit sector are all about giving. And giving is great, and giving has to be expanded, but you don't convince the nonprofit sector to have faith in this sector if you hide what 90% of its revenue is coming from. We have to find a way to explain why that's good, why it's legitimate, and why it is that this sector is doing the job that it is. So in a way, one way to think about this is that there are sort of two imperatives facing the sector. One of them is a survival imperative, and the other one is a distinctiveness imperative. And every nonprofit manager and every group supporting the sector is making decisions every day about the balance between those two imperatives. And in my view, the survival imperative has had the upper hand. And we as a society have not really been hard enough at work making it possible for nonprofit executives to give equal weight to the distinctiveness imperative. And what we now must do is to come in behind all of you who are nonprofit executives and somehow provide the support that allows you to do the things that have long made this sector so special. And that's what I think all of us owe to all of you. So it's been said that the quality of a nation can be seen in the way it treats its least advantaged citizens, but I guess the message this morning is that it can also be seen in the way, in the way that it treats its most valued institutions. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to ask our panelists to join us up here on the stage, and if there's a way that I can, there we go. Raise my hands in the, yes, and Lester, please join us. on the panel. We're going to ask each of our panelists to make remarks of 5 to 10 minutes. We're running a little bit behind, basically because we got started late, so I hope you'll be patient, and we will have time for a good question and answer interaction with all of you. Leading off with his remarks is going to be Joe Arnold of SunTrust Bank, followed by Alicia Phillip and Dave McMurtry. So, Joe, you want to kick it off? I think
Thank
you're
you.
on.
Thank you, Dennis. Dennis asked me if I would make some remarks really from a couple of perspectives. One, for the last 11 years, I've led a team at my company that works exclusively with Atlanta's nonprofits. He asked that I speak sort of from that perspective as well, from the perspective of a board member as I serve on a number of boards. So I'll try to bring observations from those perspectives as I talk today. But, you know, one of the things I wrote down as Les was talking is resilient. And I think that really sums up the Atlanta nonprofit community. I'm very proud of the fact that Atlanta nonprofits weathered the Great Recession, quite frankly, as well as they did. Given the severity of the economic downturn, far more nonprofits with, say, revenues of about $1 million or more made it than the 10% of all nonprofits that were predicted early in the recession would go under. Particularly surprising was the fact that very few arts and culture organizations, theaters, arts galleries, symphonies, etc., closed their doors. And arts, you know, here in the South have traditionally suffered first in economic declines. Most of these organizations had to battle to stay alive, and most are still struggling. But they've made it through the worst of the cycle. I think Marietta's Theater in the Square unfortunately closed its doors, and you know, there's a youth serving center called the Bridge that unfortunately didn't make it. But and as well, there's some private schools and some charter schools that had to close, but several of them had other issues which compounded their situations. Similar to the arts organizations, the faith community, churches and synagogues, as an example, as a sector struggled more so than most nonprofits, as average annual contributions per giving unit fell. Meanwhile, demands placed on faith-based organizations grew. Of course, these organizations rely completely or entirely on giving for both operating and capital needs. As job loss was on the incline, we saw increased church attendance and membership, but a decrease in giving. Today, revenues seem to have stabilized, but most churches have yet to return to pre-recession levels, as giving per giving unit is still weaker than before. On the higher education front, with so many people, both young and not so young, unable to find work, many turn to college, grad school, and technical schools to improve their chances for employment. That puts significant pressures on colleges to add classrooms and dorm space. But most, I think, have very wisely resisted this pressure, fully aware that even if they could afford to build new buildings, this enrollment bubble that they are experiencing could just as rapidly burst. At most of Atlanta's private K-12 schools, we saw an interesting development during the recession. The long-coveted wait list for early education became something of the past, as parents determined the expenditure was no longer justified in the face of their new economic reality. Tuition assistance, also known as scholarships, was in high demand, and most schools had to significantly increase their assistance to retain their families. On the capital spending side, most private schools postponed new projects over the last 4 or 5 years and now face pent-up demand. A lot of these schools are now in the early phases of capital project planning, but everything about fundraising has changed. Today's campaigns seek to raise smaller amounts of money than previously, and the execution of these campaigns simply takes more time. And this isn't just limited to private education. Examples of this can be seen in the two most recently planned additions to the tourist offerings at Centennial Olympic Park, specifically the National Center for Civil and Human Rights and the College Football Hall of Fame. You know, I'd venture to say that 5 years ago, the National Center for Human Rights would have raised the $80 million plus that it planned to raise by now and would have built its originally proposed structure. Instead, because of this great recession, the center's leadership are currently focused on building the first of what will be a 3-phased project. The College Football Hall of Fame has struggled to raise money needed to build its originally planned facility, so the design has been reworked to come up with something that can be funded, but now using both fundraised dollars and long-term debt. Turning to public K-12 school systems, you know, they continue to suffer from steep revenue declines resulting from the multi-year free fall in assessed real estate values. As a result, we will continue to see cuts in education funding and increasingly larger class sizes. And I think you can also count on a pretty coordinated effort by city, county, and school board leaders lobbying their state legislators to repeal the law that caps assessments on property tax appreciation, the law here on the Georgia books. You know, go to the social services sector. Again, they also fared better than expected, despite government reimbursements really not keeping up with the growing demand. We observed at a critical point in the downturn that a number of foundations that historically only funded capital projects temporarily offered operating grants for a year or two to help nonprofits serve the growing need. And United Way, as most of you know, also stepped up its efforts in that regard. There are significant headwinds which continue to blow here in Atlanta across the nonprofit landscape. But, as I said during the outset, I'm very proud of how our nonprofits here performed during and after this great recession. I think it's a testament to the talent running and guiding many of our nonprofits, specifically the executive directors and CEOs and their leadership teams, and the volunteer boards. I think the advent of programs like the nonprofit studies at Georgia State and Johns Hopkins and other places, that the advent of those programs have led really to a greater professionalism within the ranks of today's nonprofits. Les talked about that a little bit in his presentation. And attracting board members who bring a very diverse set of skills and experiences has also helped greatly. I noticed far more nonprofits are developing strategic plans. And even before the recession, we began to see nonprofits align themselves more strategically with funders and others who have vested interest in their missions. Nonprofits are narrowing their focus and going deeper with the right entities and developing longer relationships and finding ways to add more value to those relationships. 100 Black Men of Atlanta, I think, is a great example of this. John Grant, the CEO there, approaches potential sponsors and offers funders and other funders using the language that the business leaders understand, like ROI, return on investment. He presents to them well-developed information about what their investments in the 100 will return. And it's about a lot more than just doing good in the community. Another thing he does is he seeks to bring together these sponsors to have them collaborate with one another for their own business development purposes. You know, earlier I mentioned changes in capital campaign fundraising. Now I'd like to just highlight what I've observed about event fundraising over the last 5 years. Specifically, more nonprofits have done a great job of aligning new events with constituent groups that really form a better fit for them. Good example, a number of years ago, Boy Scouts of America here in Atlanta was looking to enhance revenues by adding a new event to attract adults who both value what scouting does for boys, but who also like to hunt. From that came a wildly successful sporting clays event that is held each November. I think it was about the same year that the YWCA began an event around hats and purses that cast a pretty wide net, which has drawn a large number of new female volunteers and donors to that organization. A more recent new event was the Botanical Gardens edition of a holiday light display last year. Not only did it draw thousands to the garden during the winter season, which is typically a little slower, but it also introduced hundreds of first-time visitors to the garden and raised a good amount of money as well. And those are just some of the many creative events that nonprofits have recently devised to reach new donors, better align themselves and deepen relationships with existing donors, and create new sources of revenue. Increasingly, I also find nonprofits more creative than ever before in their design of new programs that contain earned income streams. Here's one example. The YMCA of Metro Atlanta presented a plan to a corporation to provide the corporation's employees with Y memberships beginning in 2013. Well, you ask yourself, why would the corporation agree to do this when it's going to add expense to the corporation? Well, they want to better control their health care premiums, both for the employer and employees, and to create a healthier and presumably happier workforce. Just yesterday, I was meeting with Matt Piper, who I think may be in the audience. Matt's the CEO of Open Hand. He shared with me a new venture where they provide nutrition coaching and wellness programs to Coca-Cola Company, TBS, Alston & Bird, and National Distributing. The goal at Open Hand is to work with these corporations to offer nutrition education and meals to their employees. The nutritious meals that Open Hand provides and delivers to these companies come from their Good Measure Meals entity. Profits from this entity benefit Open Hand's ability to serve its mission. So the corporations get healthier employees, the employees learn how to eat more responsibly, and for those who purchase the meals, they know that they're helping Open Hand further its mission to those who need but cannot afford a nutritious meal each day. And the purchaser doesn't have to go home and prepare dinner. He just picks it up as he leaves work. And finally, this arrangement further strengthens Open Hand's financial picture, making them an even more viable nonprofit long term. So in summary, again, I think resilience is the right word. It appears as though Atlanta nonprofits are becoming increasingly savvy due to thoughtful planning and strong professional and volunteer leadership. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. A lot of inspirational examples there. And Alicia?
Great, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I sort of want to pull out 4 themes that Lester had in his work. I'm not sure I had the answers as much as I have questions that I think we all here need to deal with. The first one is the impulses that Lester talked about, the volunteerism, professionalism, civic activism, and commercialism. And he sort of had different styles and different ways that organizations were run. And, when I was reading that, my strongest impulse in thinking about that was we need them all. And we need them all at different times. And I equate it to we need those as arrows in a quiver. And we need to use them specifically at different times. The old adage that goes, you can teach a person to fish, you can fish for a person. And as my friend Tom Glenn says, sometimes you just need to give somebody a fish. And I think that really is indicative of all 4 of those, that you need to, sometimes you need that volunteerism. You really need the one-on-one people working with people. A lot of times we really, as a sector, have got to be more professional, both managerial professionalism as well as the social professionalism. Civic activism, public policy, changing how the system works is critical in some areas. We can't make a difference without doing it. And yes, we do need the social entrepreneurial activities. They are totally appropriate in some areas and totally inappropriate in other areas. They work for some organizations like Open Hand, but they wouldn't work in some other areas. And so I think that we've got to not go down one path, but we have to make sure that we keep all 4 paths strong, but use them correctly. Now, what Lester challenged me last night was, who gets to hold the quiver and pull the arrows out? Of course, my answer was me, but no. But I mean, that is a really important question, is where does the control lie over those decisions being made? And I think that that is the unanswered question in being able to figure out which technique is used. The other thing that I wanted to draw out that you didn't really sort of put up there on the chart, you showed about the growth in fees and the growth in government funding and the growth in philanthropy from 1997 to 2007 for nonprofits, but you didn't talk about sort of the absolute number. I mean, you didn't show the diagram for the absolute numbers. And the absolute numbers are close to that. Fees are 52%, government is 38%, and philanthropy is 10%. And that is totally not the narrative we tell ourselves about this sector. And it's not the narrative that anybody thinks about this sector, as Lester said. And I grapple with, would it help us or hurt us to own what the sector looks like? And I think we probably need to do a lot more work in educating people about the nonprofit sector and its values and sort of having some of those value statements first before we really go public with that information, which of course is public, but I mean before we really tout it. That is not what people think of at all when they think of the nonprofit sector. I do not think that's what they're thinking. I mean, when Lester and I participated in some work in the early 80s and looked at Atlanta nonprofit organizations, fees at that point were 44%, and they've gone up to 52%. So it's always been a significant part of nonprofit for quite some time. The third piece is, I think that we stand a very real threat of losing the charitable deduction or having the charitable deduction significantly limited. I think in these economic times, it is under threat. And I don't know what the tax credit, I've never seen any real analysis of what Lester said about a tax credit and what that would mean in terms of revenue for the sector. So I personally don't know if that's a viable alternative to the tax deduction. But I really worry that the potential, and it's only 10% comes from philanthropy, but I think that 10% could be threatened if we all don't really pay attention. And that gets to the last one, which is I believe in what Lester said, that the renewal scenario is probably the strongest scenario that we would want to follow, rather than just the celebration and sort of drift where we don't really do anything or go full force just into social enterprise. I think we need to really think seriously about what our value proposition is and how we educate and communicate that value proposition. That's what's going to maintain for the sector continuing to have the charitable deduction. My challenge back to Lester was, after reading it, it's like, but where does that responsibility lie to who brings the people together to have that conversation? And how, do we start it at a local level and build up? Is it a conversation that has to happen nationally pretty quickly because things are changing so fast? And I think that's one of the biggest worries I have, is that we've been in such survival mode for so long that we haven't stopped to say that things were going to get tighter and tighter and tighter, and our value proposition is not obvious to everyone else. So those were my thoughts.
Thank you. And I've made a little note to add archery to our curriculum. And Dave McMurtry.
Thank you, everyone, and good morning. I'm honored to be here with you all, as well as my fellow panelists. I was sitting in the audience and thinking, after following these two, what would you really like to hear? And so I'll start with a story, and that is to say, and this is a true story, it was 5 years ago, I was incredibly fortunate to be building technology companies, and as 5 years as an M&A banker on Wall Street, and I was using my nights and weekends as a volunteer pilot with Doctors Without Borders and building Kiva and others, and I thought maybe I might want to go into the nonprofit world full time. What are the chances I have value to add? And I read the first version of this book. So Dr. Solomon, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. That said, I also thought, what could I do to make this actually interesting? And so I am, in the spirit of your students back in Baltimore, I thought I'd go through, and instead of offering prepared thoughts, I thought I would go through and actually grade your book based on my experience at Habitat. Maybe we can have a little fun discourse here. So, with your permission, I'll imagine he shook his head, yes. So again, my role at Habitat, I'm honored to be the Senior Vice President of Strategy, which means my team is responsible for the 5-year strategic plan of the organization, which is to say, how do we go from building 100,000 houses last year to serving millions of families around the world? And I'll start with a quick survey. How many here have ever volunteered on a Habitat project anywhere? Thank you. You take your other hand and then please clap it, because you're changing the world, changing your community. Thank you. I will tell you, like you, I just came from East Palo Alto, where which is a suburb south of San Francisco, where my team, back when I was a banker, I would take all of these bankers and engineers and finance people, and we would go to the rougher parts of town, and we would build a house. And this story that concluded last week, amazingly, is in 1995, we took a recent immigrant family and put them in a house in East Palo Alto. And I went back last week. They were actually moving out of the house. One of the sons had graduated from Berkeley, got a job at Google, bought his mom and dad a new house down the street, and we're moving a new Habitat family in. And so that's the type, when we talk about the cycle of poverty and what gets me so excited, those are the type of stories that I love to tell. As I think about Dr. Solomon's book and his, not only his book, but his thoughts today, I'll start with the 4 impulses. I give you a grade of an A. It couldn't be more spot on. Habitat as an organization is dealing with all 4 of those and succeeds because of all 4. Volunteers, we had 1 million volunteers last year around the Habitat world. Professionalism, we are seen as the housing development expertise around building sustainable and energy, using renewable energy and technologies. Civic activism, whether it be the self-help ownership program or the HUD Section 4 or even Haiti around addressing land tenure in housing in Haiti. This is all successes we have seen because of getting all of our volunteers. We have an event called Habitat on the Hill where people come to drive advocacy for real effort, for real issues. And then finally, this idea of commercialization and professionalism. This is something that we're very, very excited about. Many of you know of our Restore operations. This is an idea that we're very excited about. It's a real example of social entrepreneurism within an existing traditional nonprofit. I'll give you a quick example. The house next door to me in Virginia Highlands is being knocked over. It's an 1890s bungalow, and normally it would have simply been dragged to landfill. The Habitat Restore takes the amazing chandeliers and windows and bathtubs, and they have a Goodwill-like Restore where people from the neighborhood can come and buy these unbelievable materials that you simply cannot buy. And when they do, their profits go to building new Habitat houses also in Atlanta. So it's an example of a win-win-win, where last year we had, around the U.S., we had $250 million top-line revenue in our Restores, $77 million in bottom-line profits that went to building houses, and we kept 250,000 tons of garbage out of landfills. So this idea of commercialism and professionalism and bringing new ideas is alive and well at Habitat. The fiscal challenge, also Dr. Solomon, an A, couldn't be more spot on. This is the more obvious one. I'll give you a little more detail. Our challenge at Habitat, we have grown 5 consecutive years since the recession started really in late 2007. But what is unknown is that internally we've had a shift from unrestricted to restricted giving, which means that people, because of technologies, and I'll speak to Kiva and others, where there's a real peer-to-peer connection, the world has changed from even the large nonprofits. People want to say, I want to give you $50, but I want it to go to this project. I want you to use it this way. And rarely does someone call and say, I want to give you $100, and I want to use it on some of those, I think, Dr. Solomon's charts around technology, staff development, strategic planning. Nobody ever calls and says, I want to give you $100. Could you please use it to buy the latest version of Microsoft Office? That never, ever happens. And yet, we can't succeed as an organization if we don't have professional staff development, top-line technology. So fiscal challenge is absolutely a struggle of ours. The competition challenge. Dr. Solomon said there's no stock market for nonprofits. There isn't today. I would like to think that there might be in the near future. I am a believer in the B Corps. I do believe that my friends, where I remain an advisor back in San Francisco, whether it's Ben Rattray at Change.org or Matt Premel at Kiva or even Blake Mykoski, Tom's Shoes, I know that many of you are fans of these products. I do believe that someday there will be a way to create a market and align incentives and rewards for organizations. I do believe that the C Corps are not right for doing good and doing the best good in the world. I also believe that sometimes nonprofits are given a room to play that is unfair. They are allowed to fail because of the quality of their brands, the fact that they mean well, they mean to do well. They're not held to the same standards that C Corps are. And so I'd like the panel, maybe this time or another time, to think about, if it's not a B Corp, then what is the middle ground where we keep the bar high as we do for-profits, and yet we do all the good and we're really serving for the community and not shareholders the way we do for nonprofits. The legitimacy challenge is absolutely right. This idea of fees, is it appropriate for Habitat to charge fees? Some say, well, you should just raise the cost of the houses. You're subsidizing too much. But we push back. We don't want to do that. We like to say we're a hand up, not a handout. But we don't want to only serve the people who are just marginally poor. We want to serve the people who are coming to this country and can sort of experience and realize the future in why they came here, or maybe they've been here for generations. We don't want to help just the people who might be struggling this year and need a 5% subsidy. We really want to help the people who need a 10 and 20 and 30% subsidy. So we do not propose raising fees for them. We do propose raising fees. Alicia was telling a great story last night how she went to a Habitat Restore and bought a shovel. That would be an example for us of raising fees. It's a win-win-win. She got a shovel. I believe it was Home Depot in this example had given us a donation of materials, and we took all of the profit from that and we gave it to building a house in Southwest Atlanta. That's an example where we believe that the fees is relevant and appropriate and a positive thing for Habitat. Dr. Solomon, I will challenge you. You said that nonprofits are an old idea. I was chatting with a couple of GSU students outside, and I won't name them. I'll tell you, I was very excited that they came in shorts, T-shirts, and were loading up on the coffee and juice. I love that you are here. I will tell you, my friends who are in the B Corp space, my student friends, will be much stronger than you are, and they will simply say, you nonprofits are doing it wrong. You've got it all wrong. You've got to figure out a way where, like Tom's Shoes, where people line up to buy a product that does good in another country. So I separate myself from those slides. I separate Habitat and other nonprofits like us. You go to church, you go to a hospital, you go there because it's much for yourself as for others. For nonprofits like Habitat, we have to create an experience where they are giving or they're volunteering their time 100% for somebody else. And when they do that, they've got to do it because they believe it's the best thing for the community. So I'd like to jump to your scenarios, and sort of in the spirit of fun and intelligent discourse. I'm not sure I agree with 1, 2, and 3 as the exhaustive list of scenarios. I think perhaps there's a fourth, and I think it might be a combination of 2 and 3. I'll tell you right now, I think the status quo is not an option. We talk about our statement of intent at Habitat in our 5-year plan. How are we going to serve even 1 million families in 5 years? Because those living in poverty housing around the world is a current market of 1.6 billion. So we should be proud of the fact that today we're the largest private home builder in the U.S., but it's a drop in the bucket compared to 1.6 billion. So the status quo is not an option. So if social entrepreneurism is option 2 and renewal is option 3, I will tell you this. I believe that we are on what's called the hype curve. Any of you fans of, I believe it's a McKinsey, if someone's in the audience and can tell me the source of this, please correct me. In technology, we have something that's called the hype curve, and that is, it's called the technology trigger at the bottom, and then this, I think what's called the heightened expectations at the top, and then you drop down to the trough of disillusionment, and then you head up on this slow path of enlightenment. So think smartphones. 10 years ago, as an early adopter, I bought my first smartphone. It was really great in concept, didn't work. I couldn't get anything to work. I got really frustrated, and this is in 1999-ish. I threw it out, went back to my flip phone. Fast forward, here we are. I would be surprised if anyone in the audience didn't have a smartphone. So what was that path? It was the technology trigger. Everyone gets very, very excited. You peak at expectations. You drop down to the trough of disillusionment because it doesn't really work, and you throw it out. And then slowly but surely, all of the vendors and partners come in to make the experience real. I believe that we are headed up towards the peak of heightened expectations around B Corps. And other social tools and actors that Dr. Solomon's talking about, we will soon drop. I expect in the next 2 to 3 years, there will be a lot of negative associations around the B Corp organizations and what they're really doing. I'm excited about that path of enlightenment when we create new ideas and we're innovative and we continue to be disruptive so that nonprofits can say we are doing good in the world. We're not reliant on the government to fund us. And that ultimately we're creating win-win-wins like the Habitat Restore. So I guess in closing, I would say if I were in your shoes and perhaps thinking about is the nonprofit world right for me as either a full-time or a partnership, I have 4 conclusions. 1, you must have a strong volunteer work prop or a clear peer-to-peer strategy, which is to say you have to be able to communicate your impact well. Either be like a Habitat, where anywhere you go, half the organization knows and loves and supports Habitat, or you have a strong peer-to-peer connection the way Kiva does, where even giving a $25 small loan, you know that person, you communicate with them, and you know the impact of your efforts. 2, you must have a strong earned income strategy. I think I'm repeating most of what the panel has said, but I like to call it maturity. In the same way that we all tell our kids, don't grow up expecting mom and dad to pay for everything, I think as nonprofits we should have the same approach. Don't grow up expecting the governments or wealthy donors to support and pay for everything that we do. 3, create and measure real value the same as if you were a for-profit business. Tell you from all my days of building startups and going to venture capitalists and saying I need $10 million, if I had done what the nonprofit world does, which is to say, trust me, we're really, really great people, we're serving a real problem, I can't give you any metrics, I can't tell you what % market penetration I'll have in 5 years, I can't tell you who I'm going to hire, I would have been thrown out the door. We as a industry need to mature, and we need to treat the nonprofit world the same way, and the nonprofit funds the same way we treat the for-profit funds. And then finally, I would like to say in combining 2 and 3, if you're a nonprofit, make sure that you are either a key component or better, a creator and a catalyst of a public-private compact or a group of folks. I'll give you an example of how Habitat has done it. There's a community called Harambee. It's Swahili for come together. It's the 4th most poverty-stricken neighborhood in the United States. It's outside of Milwaukee. That was literally a drug den. And Habitat went in as the catalyst, and we took public-private, we took governments, we took private, Thrivent Financial, gave a $4 million lead donation. We worked together with other nonprofits to build schools and health, and we even bought a charter school. And my wife is the COO of KIP, was hugely in favor of this. We actually even bought a charter school in to build a whole community. 5 years later, that is a thriving community where when you go there are more people outside on a Friday evening than are inside. That's an example where Habitat is seen as the catalyst. We ran the numbers, a 5-to-1 ratio. For every dollar that we took of government funds, we brought in $5 of private funds and efforts. And now Harambee is a model community in the United States. I'm proud to say that Habitat was the catalyst, but we're not solely successful or responsible for the success of that program. It was all the other nonprofits, and we are seen clearly as a model, and we're gonna replicate that across the United States. So when you're thinking about the role you want to be, don't take the old mindset in, we're going to go in and do everything. Be the catalyst to bring publics and privates together. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. I mean, some of Dave's enthusiasm has got to be infectious. I mean, it's just fantastic. Les, if it's okay with you, why don't we go directly to questions and answers from the audience? And
He's a pretty soft grader, so I don't have to.
yeah, and Les is pretty good as part of the response team in saying what he's going to want to say anyway. So there'll be plenty of opportunity to respond both to the panel and to your questions. But if you'd like to ask a question, please come up to one of the microphones, and I ask you to make it a question and make it short so that we can get as many questions in as we can. As I said, we're running a little late, but we have at least 20 minutes, or we'll push it past that if we need to. And please engage the speaker and the panel in some interesting conversation. Please identify yourself and go from there.
Good morning. I'm Ann Harper of Harper Consulting. I am very curious in your data, Professor Salomon, about the fact that the one subgroup that showed that it was not reliant on an increase in fees is the environmental sector. And I wondered if you have any thoughts about why that is. And my own just sort of trying to think about it for the last 40 minutes since I saw that piece of data, is that perhaps that it is, in fact, an advocacy sector, and that there's a real difference between services and advocacy, and there are organizations that do both, service and advocacy, but there are some that are simply advocacy organizations, and I just wonder what your take is on that particular cut of the sector, advocacy versus services, and where the environment might fall in that sector.
Thank you. Les, you want to?
You want me to take it now, or you want to get several? I'm happy to.
Why don't you give us a good,
Yeah.
crisp answer?
So
to
I
that,
think
and anybody else that
you're
wants to
asking
jump
two
in?
questions. So one of them relates to environment, and one relates more generally to advocacy. And you know, I think the environmental picture that we have is likely to be in transition. I think there are environmental organizations that are, you know, taking Dave's recommendation. There are certainly internationally companies that are building various kinds of environmental solar panels and clean tech and so forth that essentially lower the cost of environmental improvements. But I do think that the advocacy groups, and this is now generally the challenge with advocacy, we have a real problem financing advocacy in this country. Curiously, if you look at the funding of the advocacy, more of it comes from government than comes from foundations. And part of that is a regulatory phenomenon. That is, we have so tied the hands of foundations. I don't know if you want to comment on this, that foundations are very skittish about getting involved in advocacy. So it's really individuals or it is government that is the funding. And the government funding takes the form of providing support for some other function that the organization is doing, and with some of that support, they're able to do advocacy work or something that is close to advocacy but is not lobbying. You know, we have this distinction in our country between advocacy and lobbying. Organizations are not allowed to do more than a certain amount of lobbying. It turns out that the barrier is much higher than a lot of organizations think, or that their lawyers warn them against. And so there's a real pull on lobbying and advocacy, much more than it seems to me is healthy for a country like ours. The restrictions on foundations were part of a compromise that formed in the 1969 Tax Act. Its origins have to do, in truth, with the civil rights battle. This was a response on the part of some legislators from, sadly, this part of our country, who basically were unhappy that foundations were supporting the civil rights struggle, and who saw in that measure an opportunity to tie the hands of foundations. And we're still living with that. And it seems to me that, you know, it's one of the vestiges of the civil rights resistance. We should eliminate that, or somehow find a way to alter it. You know, we're living in this world now thanks to the Citizens United Supreme Court case, in which all restrictions were lifted from for-profit corporations in their electoral activity, and nonprofits are still under this pretty heavy load of restrictions on political activity, lobbying activity. And so it is truly another case of an unequal playing field. And I think that regulatory set of restrictions inhibits the ability of us to find ways to finance nonprofit, including environmental advocacy. So in some versions of my renewal strategy, I've thrown in something that says we're in the business of deregulating all these other things. We should deregulate nonprofit advocacy.
So we'll take another question now, and if the other panelists would like. Martin, the distinguished Martin Layfeld.
Off-cited. Les, in your remarks, you cited the particular vulnerability right now of smaller agencies. The standard response that often comes from the government and for-profit sectors, even foundations, is small agencies, small nonprofit agencies need to get together. They need to collaborate. They need to merge. Does your research suggest that that is a strategy, and is any of that going on?
Yeah, I guess, my general reaction to that is to be very skeptical of that argument. We don't hear that so much in the for-profit sector. We've got, in my neighborhood, probably 5 cleaning stores. Why do we need 5? That's a lot of equipment and so forth. Well, in the for-profit sector, the answer is, well, if they've got customers, they'll survive. But never would we impose a limit of the number of X. We thrive instead on the whole concept of innovation. We're willing to accept a certain degree of inefficiency because of the premium that's put on the gains that come from innovation. And so every time I hear that, it sounds like a great argument, but on what basis? Now, if Alicia were in charge, as she put it before, of deciding which ones get the thumb up and which the thumbs down, I would have a little more confidence. But that's not likely to be the case, and it may be that lots of extraneous considerations. So I think the better solution to this problem is not merger of agencies, but maybe merger of functions. That is, organizations retain what it is that is the fire in the belly that brings an entrepreneur, in this case a social entrepreneur out. They've got a mission, they have an idea, they want to try it out. But we should encourage them and build pathways that allow them to share some of the back office functions, the accounting functions, some of the human resource activities that are costly, so they can function as an independent organization, take a run at their idea. I think there is a market in the nonprofit arena. That is, some organizations make their case convincingly to funders and some don't, so they will disappear. But I can't find a way to come up with a criterion that would allow me to confidently say that these 7,500 organizations should go out of existence. I think it's one of the great strengths, and it would be a shame to lose it.
Alicia, do you have a comment on that? Or?
Well, I think that right now we're in a time, though, that it's kind of like the availability of bank financing for-profit businesses to start. I think that resources, foundation and philanthropic resources are limited, and some people are really thinking we've got to keep alive some of the ones that we already have and strengthen those, and that the ability to be able to start new organizations is limited at this point in time with the constrained economy.
Another question over here? Well, okay. Yes, you're up with the microphone.
Hi, this question is not my
Please
own, but
let us know who you
Oh,
are.
I'm sorry. My name is Vivian Vaughn. This question is not my own, but one of my classmates. He actually resides in Kenya, and he volunteers for an organization that advocates for the education of orphans and promotion of community welfare. And his question is, what are the key functions an organization has to meet or accomplish for it to be considered universally successful, or can organization success be subjective?
You should let David take that one.
Dave, yeah.
Happy to take that.
I was thinking,
Thank you, Vivian.
put you on the spot.
We happen to have a very similar program. We call it our Orphans and Vulnerable Groups. We are one of the largest providers of shelter for children with HIV and mothers with HIV, AIDS, and victims of violence in southern Africa, mostly in Zambia. Excuse my cold. I mentioned a little bit earlier when I said that nonprofits need to start operating with the business rigor and acumen of for-profits. It's all about being able to communicate the impact that you have. And I'll give you the Habitat example. For 30 years, we measured the number of houses that we built. And then we extrapolated, therefore, the impact, because how could it be bad that you live in a house, or in this case, a shelter with our orphans and vulnerable groups. As part of our new strategic plan, when we go to 1 million families served by 2018, we actually have 10 specific strategic objectives, and each one of those has a set of phase 1 and phase 2 indicators. And the reason that those exist is not because we just love data, it's because we find that the funding world, whether it's the foundations, corporates, and even wealthy donors, are looking to know, what's the measure of a well-run program? So I'll tell you, inside of Habitat, the core metrics specifically around families served is we're headed towards impact measurements, not just do you live in a house, but is your quality of life improved? When possible, we measure impact on education and ultimately your ability to get a job and your health levels. You can imagine that is not something that just changes overnight. We have a 5-year plan, and we are not even sure at the end of 5 years whether we will have, via these public-private compacts, whether we'll be able to get there, but we've got a path that leads to those 3 clear indicators. Vivian, did I answer your question?
Would you like?
Hi, my name is Stacy Parker, and I am the CEO of Positive Youth Enrichment, a brand new small nonprofit. And you were talking about the previous question about how to generate revenue, and I was wondering if anyone on the panel could speak to fiscal sponsorship and see if that would be a way to sort of generate revenue.
You actually doing fiscal sponsorship for other organizations?
Yes.
Or you being fiscally sponsored by someone?
Doing fiscal sponsorship for other smaller organizations.
It's probably not a major revenue source for you because those are very, very small organizations that would need that fiscal sponsorship. And so you probably are not going to be able to generate very much. And I would be really careful if I were you because the cost of doing it actually could be greater than what you're able to charge. And so it may wind up actually costing you money to be a fiscal sponsor.
Okay.
Be
Thank you.
careful.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Marty Collier with Collier Consulting. And I totally agree with Dr. Solomon saying that the nonprofit sector really needs to be deregulated from being able to do lobbying and more advocacy. But the IRS structure now does allow for nonprofits to do considerable education on the issues, grassroots lobbying that doesn't specify a legislative project. And it also allows for organizations to take the H election a form where then they keep track of the money that they actually do use on legislation. Do you think this is an area where nonprofits are not being adequately educated to how to do the advocacy and lobbying? Or is this just another layer that's really onerous and it would be really hard to keep up with? And this really could be for anybody on the panel or yourself who have experience with this.
It's a very good point. And in fact, Tim Delaney at the National Council, new name, Council of Nonprofits, makes a very strong point of this, that nonprofits really aren't taking advantage of the full potential of that option. But
And I think sometimes it's the boards of nonprofits.
And the foundations, I would think.
Yeah, and the funders. But the interesting thing, and that goes back to the other question before, I do think that individual and foundation funding for advocacy and lobbying up to the extent that it can has got to increase because as this whole thing is switched, and as governments now are putting money in the hands of the people who are buying the services, that government money, the fungible money within an organization to be able to take that government money and use it for advocacy is less and less and less because the dollars that somebody's paying for a service, if they have Medicaid dollars or Medicare dollars and they're paying for a service, that doesn't include any money for advocacy. So the amount of money for advocacy, I think, is significantly decreasing from those kinds of dollars.
Agree. And also to have a little fun with my fellow panel member, philanthropies are not as
No,
excited
they're
about
not.
funding advocacy. I'll use a real example in Detroit. After the recession, we went to the White House with the Neighborhood Revitalization Initiative, which Pat Decker, please stand up and say hi, who runs this effort at Habitat. Please, if you want to get involved with Habitat in the U.S., please come see Pat. We went to them and said, look, you're thinking about spending a whole lot of money in Detroit and building big housing projects on blocks. How about instead you give some of that money to Habitat? We'll go take that same 5-to-1 ratio. We'll create $5 for every dollar that you give us from corporates and privates. And we're going to take those blighted blocks and we're going to fix up these beautiful old houses and sell them at a subsidy to people who can pay the mortgage. And in general, the philanthropies said we're not so excited about funding this advocacy, even though you're going to ultimately create, which we did, $250 million in funding for cities. We got philanthropies excited about building the houses, but not the advocacy, even though the leverage was 10-to-1.
Yeah. And I think as well, the challenge of outcomes measurement from advocacy is a big challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Vis-a-vis somebody who's getting treatment at a hospital, a nonprofit hospital, or who's making a gift for a stroke center, where the outcomes of that gift are significantly more measurable.
Yeah. And this is where the civic activism impulse and the commercialism impulse do have a little bit of conflict. But I think, I think both things are true, or all three things are true that we've been talking about. There's more advocacy and lobbying allowed than lots of nonprofits execute. That's true. Number two, there is an enormous amount of regulation that you have to clear your way through in order to get to that conclusion. And it's not only the laws, the IRS laws on existing advocacy, it's the campaign finance laws, of which there have been 2 or 3 major sets of laws in the last half decade that impose additional things that you have to work your way through. And then there are the foundation restrictions, and then there's the board concerns. And these are all barriers in the way. So I think, you could tell from the thrust of what I've said, I think this is a very fundamental feature of the nonprofit sector. I'm delighted to hear that Habitat, sees that. All organizations have to see it, and it's not easy to finance, and it's not easy to demonstrate, but it is so central to the purpose of the sector that we continuously have to clear the brush away so that there is room for nonprofits to continue to perform that advocacy role.
I mean, I think it points out that, not everything that the nonprofit sector does or should do can be solved through commercial financing or enterprising in the marketplace. And therefore, even though the trends are what they are, we cannot give up on all of the sources that support the sector. Philanthropy, even though it's a decreasing share, needs to be bolstered. We need to get government back in the business of supporting some of this stuff. Nonprofits maybe need to build up their own resources through investments, because some of the important work of the sector just simply isn't going to get done through a commercial strategy.
But one word on the philanthropy thing, because, some of you may know this, but some of you may not. Community Foundation did a study about philanthropy, volunteering, and civic engagement in 2010. And the good news was that 2/3 of the people surveyed, 2,700 statistically correct sample for the 23 counties, 2/3 of the people had given in the past year. And that's like, wow, that's great, 66%. But when we did the same study in 2001, it was 80%. So there is, and that's just all people. That's not just certain wealth or anything like that. It's just generally people. So we have a real job to do as the economy recovers in the metropolitan Atlanta area, to all of us to encourage philanthropy to rebound as the economy rebounds.
Yes.
Hello, how are you all doing?
Yes,
My name is Angelou Ezilo. I'm the Executive Director of Greening Youth Foundation. It's an environmental nonprofit organization whose mission is to really engage underserved youth and connect them to the outdoors and careers in conservation. So I guess my question is really regarding empirical data and qualifying the intangibles. So most of our funders or potential funders are interested in the bottom line. So how do we know that what you're doing is actually working? So we're in our 6th year, so we don't always have that data to say that their math grades have improved because they've been exposed to nature. So I just wanted you all's advice, so we don't have that product all the time to show that this definitely works, you should invest in it. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
You can take it eventually, but let me play the devil's advocate. I think this is one of the great dilemmas that the sector is creating for itself, or that is having created for it. It is another case of the tension between the commercialism impulse and some of the other impulses. And it is disadvantaging seriously the smaller organizations, which just don't have the capability. Having said all that, I don't think we have a choice. I think the sector has got to continue to work, and it may require coalitions of organizations in similar fields that try to crack this problem. It may require engagement of the university to try to get help in that kind of technical work. We are well beyond the world in which the trust theory of the nonprofit sector is sufficient. You know, we had an economic theory that said that you use nonprofits in those cases precisely where you cannot get a good handle on what the product is that you're producing, because the consumer is different from the person paying for it, and that you can't have a market relationship like you have in the regular market, and therefore you need a nonprofit sector in those circumstances where trust is an important part. Well, trust is out the window, not quite completely. And this is why retaining a real coherent notion of values is important for the sector, because at the end of the day, there will be an element of trust. But I don't think we can count on trust entirely, and therefore we have to solve this dilemma.
Spot on. So I'd only add, this is an instance where the axiom from the for-profit and nonprofit world equally applies, which is, I recommend you use the data you can get and don't be held hostage by the data you can't get. And I'll tell you a for-profit example: when you're building a startup and you're asking for $5 million as seed capital because you're 5 people with a creative idea, of course you can't have the data that they want. So what you do is you go use a real pilot or case study. And so my last example, we went out and we built, we were crowdsourcing and sort of data compilers for the large publishing business. And we said, you know, I can't get you the data that you want, but I built a prototype. And we have Fortune and Forbes and Time Warner as customers. There's only 3 customers we have, but you can go talk to them all you want. We ran a case study on those 3. There's 10,000 other customers we want. We're at 0.1% penetration of the market. We're going to go get the rest based on the data that we have. I would recommend doing the same thing when you're a small nonprofit, which is the catch-22. If you ask them, that same funder, well, how about if you fund the system that I need to go get the data? Of course, they'd reject it immediately, right? And that is your struggle. And so don't be held hostage to that. Instead, say, I have the data from 2 real case studies, real pilots, and here is the real data, and I know it's real because I gathered it myself, and I talked to them, and if you want to know anything about this data, come to me because I'm the one who gathered it. And make sure that you just draw, this is the parameters that I will set, because if you let yourself be held hostage to people who decide what the random sample is, you'll always undersatisfy.
I guess the only thing I would add to that is, you know, there are organizations here in Atlanta that I think can help you. United Way has an officer who, and I know Milton was here earlier, I think he had to leave, but who has an officer who I think will help you. I suspect the Georgia Center for Nonprofits also has a person or 2 who can assist you in coming up with just a few things that can indeed be measured.
And the only thing I would close with, Alicia, it's yours, is to say it's not a function of size. It's not just small nonprofits that struggle with that. Habitat, we're $1.6 billion annual spend in 80 countries, and we are still using the case study approach. I use Harambee all the time as an example because I don't have an ERP system because the funders won't give it to me.
But there's also a really new data source in the metropolitan area, neighborhoodnexus.org, that provides you at a census tract level really phenomenal information about this community. It's not your data of your students, do you know what, but it's data about the communities you're in, and you can see how if the communities are changing or not based on some of your work and others' work.
Okay, one more question. Then we'll wrap up.
Hello. I'm Deborah Spates, and I'm with the Sickle Cell Foundation of Georgia, and we're a 40-year-old organization. I was intrigued to hear that the nonprofit sector had the 3rd largest, I believe, workforce, paid workforce, which brings me to my challenge. We are increasingly having difficulty finding affordable health care that we can provide for our workers. And I don't know if there's any advice that you could give, any strategies, but small groups are having a lot of difficulty, which also means we have difficulty attracting the workforce that we'd like to have for these new innovations.
Well, I can make a few comments about it. I'm not sure I can get down to the level of the detail in this community, but let me just say what we have learned about the health benefits of nonprofits. You know, we've done analysis of nonprofit salaries and benefits. It's a complicated picture. If you compare nonprofit salaries to for-profit salaries across the board, the nonprofit salaries are lower, no question about it. And it appears that nonprofits compensate for that by having better benefits, generally speaking. The benefit levels historically have been high. Two follow-up comments about that. So the first one is that when you look at nonprofit salaries in the fields in which nonprofits operate and compare them to the for-profit salaries in the same fields, it turns out that the nonprofit salaries are higher. And so it's not that the sector is paying low wages, it's rather that the sector is operating in low-wage fields. And this makes the benefits all the more crucial. And the second thing that, additional comment, is that advantage that nonprofits have historically had in health benefit costs in the last 5 years has just evaporated. And that whole story has been invisible in the national debate over health benefits. We were, through this listening post project, again, able to document what was happening to nonprofit benefit levels, and it's the only piece of data that has entered that debate. It's had an impact on that debate to some extent, but what this argues for is really a special sort of line of policy that is related to the nonprofit health benefit. And at the end of the day, I guess my hope is that the Obamacare law, assuming that it survives, is in fact a possible answer to that, because it's creating these networks that are going to provide a place where nonprofit employers can find reasonably costed insurance.
I think the only thing that I would add to that, and I think I would use Dave as an example, is that there are other kinds of rewards for working in the nonprofit sector, non-monetary rewards, the ability to work toward a mission that you really believe in. Here we have someone that's been extremely successful in the for-profit sector and has found his way into this sector. And perhaps nonprofit leaders need to think more about how to emphasize those non-monetary benefits in order to attract the kind of talented workforces that we want. Very quickly.
My name is Terry Walker. I'm Director of Chapel Relations at the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel at Morehouse College. And I just wanted to raise at least one question related to the connection between the faith community, the nonprofit sector, and some of those challenges, especially related to the risks that you described: growing identity crisis, demands on managers, threat of mission creep, and that sort of thing. The same sort of thing exists within the faith community, and you're looking at a significant amount of dollars, volunteer resources, and that sort of thing that exists in that. So I wonder, as you talk about developing a voice, what recommendations would you have for advocacy, for professional development and training that might help prepare people in the faith community who really have the same kind of value proposition to some degree as the nonprofit sector? How would you provide some resource to those faith leaders?
Yeah. Well, this is probably something that Dave wants to weigh in as well. What I'd say, first of all, is that the faith community is, in a way, the keeper of the value proposition of the sector, and it ought not to surrender that at the end of the day. It has important contributions to make to the entire sector by keeping people focused on the value component of the sector. Having said that, I think the same story that I think Dave articulated for other parts of the sector applies to the faith community. That is, we're living in a world in which you have to create a business plan or something like it. It may not be a business plan literally, but it needs to be a really conscious attempt to connect the activities that you're engaged in with the resources and the quality of management that you need in order to get there and to get there successfully. So, and I think this is happening in general in the religious community, not simply in the nonprofit component of it. So it means developing all of that skill of management and planning that is now required of anybody operating in the nonprofit space. So you have, I think, the strong core of value. What you need to do is to preserve that while bringing in some of this business style of planning and organizing. I don't know if you wanted to.
I would only add quickly to that, Dennis, if we're short on time, is to say that Habitat is a Christian ecumenical organization. We like to say that we are religious about our principles, but not our tactics. I think the reason we are successful and we don't hide it is because we pair that with a non-proselytizing policy. We do not ever try to preach and convert. We have a policy against ever choosing a homeowner or a partner with which to work based on their religion. We were surprised as we extended internationally, including in the Middle East and also in Asia, how being very open in an internet world, in a WikiLeaks world, you can't say you're something here but not over here because people will find out the truth. Mrs. Birla, who many of you know in India, there's the Tatas and the Birlas, the two largest families and businesses. She's on our microfinance board, Microfinance India board, and very active, of course, as a multi-billion-dollar family and a foundation. At our very first meeting, she said, when we launched right into negotiations and discussions, she said, wait, aren't we going to pray? I thought you guys were a Christian organization. And it taught us a real lesson. And she said, look, I'm Hindu, but I believe in the values of most religious organizations, and if you try to hide it from me, then I'll wonder what you're hiding. And so if you pair with whatever religion your faith-based organization might be rooted in, if you are religious to the principles and not the tactics, I bet you'll be successful in most of your markets.
Interesting. Okay, well, that was a great discussion. I think we could go on forever in terms of the substance. I want to give Lester a chance to perhaps just provide some summary thoughts. I'm going to keep myself under control and not extend it too much in terms of my bringing it to a close after that. But Lester?
Sure. I just want to make 3 points. First of all, I want to thank all the panelists and all of you for this opportunity. 3 points. So first of all, I agree with Alicia that we don't have to choose between these impulses, that we can combine them. But I would just underline again that there are tensions, and we have to figure out how to resolve the tensions, and we have to think carefully about how to cope with the balance, and it is a balancing act. I think and it's the second point, I think her point about the narrative versus reality and her point about the charitable deduction illustrates just in 1/2 second, 1/2 minute, the tension that exists. Because here we are trapped in a political circumstance in which our entire energy as a sector has to go into defending the charitable deduction, which inevitably undercuts, because it exaggerates the importance of the charitable deduction, undercuts our effort to make the rest of the public aware of the real financial base. So here we are struggling to preserve the 10%. Meanwhile, cutting is going on in the 30% of the government support and potentially affecting the 50% or 52% of earned income. So it's a very significant trap. And this argues for a strategy for taking on the charitable deduction that doesn't drop the rest by the roadside and keeps it in public view. And I continue to be worried. Independent sector recently really almost came out and said, we're not going to fight over the charitable deduction. We're going to fight over the budget, the core of the budget. Somehow that two-legged stool has to be focused on. And then the final point is my theme about values, and I don't know whether I should give you a C for your comment or not. It depends. It depends how we interpret it. But what I heard was that Habitat is a value-based organization, but I'm not sure it made it into your fourfold list. And that is, I think, to me, the sort of telling issue in the extent to which I would endorse the sort of merged item number 4. It's only if we enter this world of social venture with the value point out front explicitly, with all the other stuff included, the stuff about having an earned income strategy and having a way to measure and having a business plan. If it's not driven by that value proposition, then we're headed for bad trouble. And the interesting thing to me, and I'll close with this, is that this porous border between the nonprofit sector and the business community is not a one-way street. And it's turning out that the one thing that the business community has taken fervently away from the nonprofit sector is the idea of having a mission. I mean, when did we, 30 years ago, come into company headquarters, and I may be wrong about this, and see blazoned on the wall the social mission of the company? Whereas you can go to AOL, you can go to many companies, and they are struggling over coming up with a mission that is not simply make more money. It is something of purpose. And so we should definitely not have the nonprofit sector surrender that item that is so precious that the business community itself has embraced it.
And when are they going to take away the better governance? I mean, I think the nonprofit sector has better governance than most corporations, and I mean, I think corporations really need to learn from the nonprofit sector there too.
And an observation, and perhaps I just assumed it was always implied. I assumed that anyone who came to a nonprofit was mission-driven. That's the reason it didn't make my list. Dr. Solomon's right to point it out. Perhaps we have to do an internal check to see who truly is mission-driven, and are we there for that reason? Great point.
Well, this has been a fantastic discussion. I tend to be an optimist and to see some of the bright spots, and there were some interesting things that have come along. I mean, Lester talked about trying to find a new way of conceptualizing the identity of the sector, and we heard that you know, the nonprofit sector was an innovator, and you know, perhaps it's not so bad that we start new industries like home health care and it gets taken over if we're thinking ourselves as innovators. Maybe that's a new role that we should emphasize. We saw that the sector was resilient and did better than the other sectors during a terrible recession. Should we make the argument that the nonprofit sector is a counter-cyclical force in a bad economy and try to get some resources behind that? And we heard about the various nonprofit ethos that are strengthening business, and we know that in nonprofit management curricula now, we've built in a lot of the learnings from the business sector, and maybe we need to extend that and make sure that the business sector starts to learn about what we have to offer from the nonprofit side. So I found this extremely stimulating and giving us lots to think about for the future. Let me just indulge you for a second and give some thank yous to people that have been instrumental in this program. Patty Johnson, Linda Serra, Matthew Durrance, Joanne Kepix, Dwayne Marshall, all from members of our partner organizations, and the leaders of those organizations, Janine Lee, Jamil Zain-Oldin, Milt Little, Val Porter, Virginia Hepner. This series would not be possible without them. Let me remind you that you can buy the books and get Lester to sign them in the lobby at deep discounts, but you know,
Fair. I already bought mine.
Lester's signatures, you know, it's like baseball cards. It's going to be worth a lot in the future.
Destroy
in my estimation, and we'll look forward to announcements for our next lecture. Will probably be sometime in the spring. This has been recorded, so it will be on the websites in one form or another of the partner agencies. And let's just take a moment again to thank Lester and the panelists for doing a terrific job.